Well, thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. I think it was going to be a 7-day festival, then it was going to be a 4-day festival, and a couple of days ago it was going to be a no-day festival, and now actually here we are. And so I think it's just wonderful that we actually do have a festival at all, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming, for making this happen, because I think it's just incredibly important that we have live events. And just a big thank you to Tanya and everybody involved in the festival for going for the real thing. I think we can have, there's only so much Zoom that anybody can take. So, you know, it's great to be here. And a big thank you, obviously, to our guest this afternoon, Robert McCrum, who's come all the way from London, and I think we share the same sort of ideas about how important it is that these cultural events should actually happen in the live and not, say, just in digital format. So we're going to be talking this afternoon about this book, Robert's latest book, which is absolutely extraordinary. And I just want to say this right now. I absolutely love this book. I think everybody should read it. It is called Shakespearean, on life and language in times of disruption. And it is actually, it couldn't be a more timely book in so many ways, in ways that we'll be hopefully discussing over the course of the next hour. Obviously, we'll do sort of the usual thing of have sort of about 45, 50 minutes of discussion between the two of us, and then we'll open up to questions. You might think that after so many centuries that there's not so much, there's nothing left to be said about Shakespeare. This book proves that is completely wrong, and that actually you can never tire of Shakespeare or never have new things to say about him. Personally, I found it incredibly gratifying to read this book because it just filled me in on so much about Shakespeare that I didn't know, partly because when I was being taught Shakespeare at school, it was sort of the structuralists were in fashion and nobody was allowed to talk about anything beyond the text, and so no context was given at all. So it's been, just on a personal note, it's been absolutely fantastic to read this book, and I'm just so glad that we're here and that this, as with so much going on today, and hours away from another lockdown, and with a sort of small drama taking place on the other side of the Atlantic, there's just so much to talk about, not just in the book itself, but how it relates to everything that's going on in our world at the moment, because we are living in a time of great disruption, as we all know. Before we start talking about the book, just a few words about Robert. So Robert is a huge figure. Everybody here, you all know who Robert is, but just to recap, he's a huge figure in the world of letters. He was the former literary editor at The Observer, was editor-in-chief at Faber and Faber for about 20 years. He has written about a dozen books, 7 novels, and on the non-fiction side, he's written a biography of P.G. Wodehouse, and also a trilogy, what he describes as a disruption trilogy, which I love, of books which kind of begin with the experience of a stroke, a very disabling stroke that he had back in 1995. And he wrote about that in a book called My Year Off, and then sort of followed on from that in his book Every Third Thought. And then this book, Shakespearean, kind of rounds off the story of perhaps everything that very powerful experience taught him about life and so much else, I think. And also just one little anecdote perhaps about Robert, just to sort of underline who he is and how important he is in the world of literature. He has, I only discovered this recently, you've edited 4 Nobel Prize-winning authors, which I think is just a little bit greedy, but absolutely extraordinary, and it says so much.
Not really.
You worked
probably
with
2,
right?
Properly.
Okay.
And then I was responsible. No one edits Harold Pinter. In fact, the first time I met him, I said, "You don't want me to make any editorial comments." He said, "Are you out of your blank mind?"
Okay. Well, I think what we'll do, if you don't mind, if we can begin to talk about this book with what is the starting point. Obviously there's the stroke, but the starting point for this book in particular, because it has so much bearing on what's happening in America right now as we speak.
Summer's Evening in June.
Exactly,
Yes,
and
yes.
Julius Caesar. So
Yes.
can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, this book is very much of the moment, I think. And first of all, can I just add my voice to Jason's? It's wonderful to be in a theatre. It's wonderful to see a live audience. It's wonderful to have a chance to, because it's a lonely business doing this sort of thing. And it's nice to get out and about. So thank you very much for coming. And as the unfurls, you'll see that what we're doing now is very much at the heart of what I think Shakespeare is all about, which is live. When you can look when you can see the sweat on the actor's face, you can see their breath, you can see their body language. When you can really feel that as an audience, that's something which is very special and quite unbelievably valuable. Yeah. So anyway, so in June of 2017, Donald Trump, who is all in our minds today, had been in office for about 6 months. And if you cast your mind back to those distant times, he was incredibly unpopular on the liberal East Coast. And the Public Theatre, which is a long-standing theatrical company in New York, puts on every summer a thing called Shakespeare in the Park. And it's free. And the New Yorkers are invited to go to it. You stand in line, you get your ticket, but you pay nothing. And they chose that summer to do Julius Caesar, the director did, and he cast Caesar as Trump. And with long red tie, white shirt, blonde wig, and he, just to add piquancy, he made Calpurnia Slovenian. And it was incredibly arresting. And every night for about 6 weeks, the president was murdered on stage in a very bloody way in front of 3,000 New Yorkers, which went down tremendously well, except, of course, that they were on the edge of the... I went to the show, got a ticket to the show. I'll tell you how I went to the show in a minute, because that's also germane to this our conversation. And it was... I've never been in a theatre which was more wired. Everyone was on the edge of their seats. It was... You could have had a pin drop. And of course, it's a play in which the main action is over by the end of Act 2, so there's got a lot of stuff about Brutus and republics and whether it's a good thing to do this or not. But anyway, it was a sensational event. It caused a tremendous stir in the American media. Fox News did a report about it, in which it only became clear towards the end that they didn't realize the play had been written 400 years ago. And it was electrifying. My neighbor who'd got me into this was a man called James Shapiro, the author of 1599 and various books about Shakespeare, who's had become a bit of a friend for reasons I didn't go into. And in fact, that evening, I thought to myself, I've got to write about why is Shakespeare always so incredibly modern? Why is this guy who died in 1616 in Stratford, far from any university or any court, and was largely forgotten for 150 years or so? Why does his work speak to us so immediately, again and again and again? And why, for example, does someone like Christopher Marlowe sort of moulder on the shelves, barely read in some respects?
And at the time, he was the superstar. I mean, this is quite interesting how...
And so for example, if Shakespeare had died in, let's say, 1596, I'll just step back briefly. I mean, just to have in your mind, he had a roughly 20-year career, Shakespeare, and 1590 to 1600, so roughly from just after the Armada to the death of Queen Elizabeth I. The second half is from the arrival of James VI of Scotland, James I of England, to his own retirement from the stage in 1611. And so it's 20 years. In those 20 years, just as an aside, about half that time he was working in what we would call plague conditions. I mean, and plague was not what we're familiar with. It was terrifying. And if you read the Elizabethan accounts of plague pits and plague suffering and doors being nailed up and the victims being unable to leave their homes, and people knowing that people going mad at realizing what they were going to suffer when they died. Because if you got the plague, you knew you were going to die. There's no question of intensive care or ventilators or anything like that. You were a goner within 24 hours in some cases. And that was his backdrop. So he's somebody he's lived at a time. You were saying at the beginning, Jason, I think it's right. I mean, I think I'd been thinking about this book in a way for about 20 years, in that I felt, ever since 9/11, and certainly during the first decade of the 21st century, for a generation such as ourselves, which had really grown up with an absence of history, such that someone like Fukuyama could write a book called The End of History in 1989. Suddenly, we were getting an awful lot of history, and now we seem to be living with history all the time. And I think one of the reasons why Shakespeare, I think, appeals to us and speaks to us so well as a modern writer is because he's also steeped in history. I mean, he grew up in a time of extraordinary chaos in England, great jeopardy, a very violent age. It was physically violent, it was disruptive. Everything was, to come back to our opening theme, everything was very much in the moment. 3 of his plays, interestingly, begin with the word now. Now is the winter of our discontent, Richard III. Now, Fair Hippolyta, that's the beginning of Midsummer Night's Dream, and then there's the beginning of King John, which I can't remember. But anyway, so he always plants you right in the moment, and he doesn't muck around. He wants to engage. He doesn't take your interest for granted. He knows that the pit is the pit, and the groundlings are the groundlings, and there are some smart young men probably around the side who are better off, who are probably more interested. But he knows he has to hold his audience, and so he'll bring on the witches at once, or he'll bring on a ghost immediately, or he'll have a violent. He's not afraid to engage people's interest by visceral. I mean, he'll gouge out an eye in King Lear, the most terrifying. I mean, scenes which even now are horrifying. Yeah. And a play like Titus Andronicus, which was a huge hit in the 1590s. I don't know how many in this audience have seen Titus Andronicus live. People faint when it's done properly.
I mean, what becomes clear in this book is, and what you do so brilliantly, is it's sort of part biography, part autobiography. But when you put the plays very much in their own historical context, and I think what works so well is to understand, for example, I didn't know this, the context behind Macbeth. James VI has just arrived from Edinburgh, and you put on the Scottish play.
I've got this thing. I say he's obsessed with risk and originality, which just runs. And actually, Macbeth is a very good example of that. But all his great plays, Lear, Othello, they start at high speed, and they put the audience on the edge of their seat. But Macbeth is a very spectacular case of Shakespeare himself putting himself at extraordinary jeopardy. Yes. Because he was the playwright for the Lord Chamberlain's men. All through the 1590s, he was their star playwright. They were the ones who had Burbage, and they had the best clown, Robert Armin. They had some really good actors. And when the Queen, and they were the Queen's favourite theatrical troupe. There's no doubt that Elizabeth favoured Shakespeare. He flatters her to death. Whenever he can, he's always flattering the Queen, especially in a play like Midsummer Night's Dream. And there was obviously a good relationship. It is said that she asked him to write Merry Wives of Windsor because she wanted to see more of Falstaff. I don't know if that's true, but no one really knows, but it may be the case. When she dies, they've lost their patron. They're in real trouble, the Lord Chamberlain's men. Not only that, there's a new regime in town. It's not just a change from Queen Elizabeth to an heir. It's a Scot. Not one Scot, it's lots of Scots. And suddenly London is full of hairy Scots all speaking a very weird kind of English. And they're quite different. They come from another country with which England has basically been at war for centuries. So there's a real disruption, and I suspect amongst the Lord Chamberlain's men, air of tremendous panic. Yes. We've lost our patron, now we've got to do a play for King James. What on earth are we going to do? we have to commission Will to get on with it. And actually, Macbeth is interesting. It's a play which, when you as you know, it's very short. It's a thriller, and it reads as though it's been written at tremendously high speed, doesn't it? It's got a narrative drive. Some people say there's a scene or an act missing to explain, because Lady Macbeth disappears for a long period in the play. But anyway, it's very fast, and it's incredibly scary. And
it's still the most successful Shakespeare play. Whenever you talk to directors,
yes, people.
Yeah.
And it's about first of all, it's about the thing which James was obsessed about and was troubled by, which was the condition of England in relation, or the uniting of the crowns of England and Scotland. So one of his objectives as king was to unite England and Scotland into the what has become the United Kingdom. So he's got one or two other things on his mind. He's had a very, very troubled upbringing and is obsessed by assassination. His mother, Mary Queen of Scots, he had witnessed assassination, had suffered assassination attempts in his own life, and he was paranoid about being killed by assassins. And he had another obsession, which is witchcraft. He'd written about witchcraft. So Shakespeare sits down to write a play about the disintegration of the kingdom with witches, in which the king is assassinated. And he puts this on. What the king's men must have, the Lord Chamberlain's men must have thought when they saw the script, they must have thought, this is going to be a really rough night. So on it goes, and James lapped it. He loved it. He had it was performed immediately again, and to the end of Shakespeare's life, the Lord Chamberlain's men, now the King's men, they were instantly called the King's men, they were in work non-stop. He couldn't get enough of it. And so going back to your point, Jason, he does something which I think is very important creatively, was he would go to the point of maximum jeopardy, real danger, and push himself into it, put himself and the audience and his creative spirit on the edge, and to take a terrible risk. It might not have worked, but it was more interesting.
But and comes out by the skin of his teeth, or does James look at that and say, this is a play that is telling us how bad it is to try and overthrow a king? I mean, does he feel more?
I think he probably, who knows?
Right.
Who knows what he thought? But it's as we know, it's a thrilling play.
Yeah.
Done. I mean, it still works. You can make it work, and again, you can make it work on a stage this size. You can make it work in an abbreviated form. It can be done in a room. I saw the Judi Dench one with is it McKinnon? Yes.
Okay.
Where they had a single light bulb, black room, no effects, stunning.
Yeah.
Absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
And it's because it goes to the heart of everything. And
it goes to the heart of everything in his own time, and then that makes it sort of universal and allows it to carry on.
And the other thing about him is that he has his eye for a plot. He's got an incredible eye for a plot, and one of the reasons why his plots are rarely his plots, that he normally borrows them from history or he steals them from somebody else, is because he knows that those archetypal stories are the ones which really work.
And maybe just to bring it back to where we started with, just America, the US, and I mean, this is something that you're particularly an expert on this, and you talk quite a lot about this, is that, the American experience of Shakespeare. And, I mean, it was Julius Caesar that you went to see. It could have been Macbeth, perhaps. And you talk, perhaps you could just explain, because I think I only became aware of this when you did the Radio 4 documentary a few years back. I think that was the first time that
That's why I was in America, in fact.
Right.
I was doing this broadcast.
Okay.
And because the interesting thing, I said at the beginning that Shakespeare is somebody who died pretty much in obscurity in 1616. There are no famous last words. 7 years later, there's the first folio. We can come on to that later on, maybe. But basically, he just dies. There are no fanfares. People who were in the know would have known he had passed away, but there was no sort of national mourning or anything. And his work doesn't go underground so much. It goes into, so it's running in neutral for a while. Milton refers to it, Dryden refers to it, and then by the 18th century you've got Pope doing Shakespeare editions. Johnson bases his dictionary on Shakespeare citations. That's by the second half of the 18th century. That's 150 years after his death. He's just beginning to be taken up, and then he becomes a kind of voice for a resurgent Britain under the Georges. And so by the time of the American Revolution, his plays are being certainly read and performed in American cities, and the Americans are discovering that he's telling them about all the issues that they can't deal with. And this is still true. So the race question in America, which is, I think, the fundamental issue in America, is one which, again and again, they'll do stagings of Othello. I mean, Othello is not just about race, but it certainly has a race element. And what you find in America, and this is still true, and it will be true after whatever happens in this next week, I mean, I think somebody's going to put on a production of Coriolanus.
It's interesting, you talk about Othello and Coriolanus being the two big plays for the Americans, is that right?
There are other, it's hard, I mean, they're all Richard II, deposition.
Right, yeah.
I was thinking as I was driving down today that on the eve of lockdown, I must say I'm glad we got in tonight, that you could do a fantastic production of Love's Labour's Lost, which is about sequestering yourself into the countryside, which could be set in a lockdown setting.
Yes,
and it would, it's just froth. It's very entertaining, but it's just froth. But you could do a COVID version of it. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah. So talked about Coriolanus. Sorry, you were.
So I think that, and I spent about 10 days in Washington, where we did the broadcast from, and a lot of American directors like to put on plays which, as it were, strike a chord with American audiences. And so by the beginning of the 19th century, Shakespeare is better established in the collective unconscious of a nation in America than in Britain. And it wasn't really until the Romantics, and Keats and Coleridge particularly, they kind of really invented Shakespeare as the kind of heroic artist, the king of the imagination. And Keats writes a poem about Keats writes a poem on rereading King Lear. Coleridge gives some fantastic lectures, thinks he's Hamlet.
But just a small detail. I mean, we were talking about the first folio. So there are, if I got this right, there are 200 copies in the world, roughly. About 5 of them are in this country, and 140 something are in the US.
There are about 10 in this country.
10 in this country, right?
They're worth the one was sold the other day for about $7 million. They're worth quite a bit.
But hundreds are in America.
And there are 300. There's a museum in Washington called the Folger Library, which is an incredible library. If you're ever in Washington and you want to spend a wonderful hour or two, just go to it's just behind the Capitol. And it was set up by an oil billionaire in the 1900s. And that's got 150 first folios. And in boxes. You go down into a bank vault and you go through an incredible amount of security, and then they show you there's the first folio of whoever it was. And what's extraordinary about the first folio, I've only seen 150 of them, or I've seen a sampling. The paper, it has no chemicals, so it's dead white. Wow. It is the most beautiful. It's like an art object.
Yes. Yeah.
And the print is incredible. And you can see the press of the hot metal and the ink on the paper. It's enthralling.
And printing is just one of the developments, huge technological developments, and other types of developments that take place in Shakespeare's. Well, it obviously doesn't happen in Shakespeare's lifetime, but it sort of comes to fruition. I know one of the things that you've talked about is, the time that Shakespeare lives. It's a very different world that he dies in.
It's a very different world. And I also, two things. It's a very different world, and he was somebody. Every writer needs to have their luck, but they have to recognise their luck. And the thing about Shakespeare is he recognises his luck really quickly. But the difference, the degree to which it is different. I mean, if you were to go back to the time when the King Charles I was executed in 1649, so the 1640s, which is only 40 years after Shakespeare had died, 2 generations. The world of the Civil War is a world which we would all recognise. Money, you have money, you have the beginnings of medicine, you have travel, you have books, printing, part of the beginnings of representative democracy, all the things and you have the role of the church. In so many ways, the world of the Civil War is the one which we can relate to. You go back 50 years into the 1590s, 1580s, you're in a world of savagery, sorcery, magic, witchcraft. I mean, it's a wild world, and with the language just beginning to be intelligible.
Right.
And Shakespeare obviously plays a huge. I know at school we find Shakespeare difficult, but actually he, compared to the dialect that would have been spoken around probably in a part of the country like Dorset, it's all over really. Yeah. The language was still in a very primitive shape, but he recognised that this was, and this also goes to another reason why he's so modern, is because he is on the side of the audience. He's on the side of the common man, of the ordinary person, the ordinary reader, the ordinary theatre goer. He wants to relate to the humanity around him, because that's how he grew up. And what language are they speaking? Are they speaking French? No, they're not speaking French. Are they speaking Latin? No, they barely know Latin. They probably can't even recognise it. They're speaking English. So he's going to write for them in English. There are different kinds of English. There's posh English, and that's courting. It's incredibly posh. And then there's ordinary English. And there are moments in the plays when you can see him getting carried away. Going back to Macbeth, there's a famous speech where Macbeth is bewailing his bloody hands after the murder of Duncan. And he says something like, he wishes that the multitudinous seas in Carnarvon would wash the blood off his hands. And you can see him thinking to himself, multitudinous seas in Carnarvon, that's good, but they're not going to get that in the pit, are they? So the next line is making the green one red.
Which is beautiful in its simplicity.
Which is very beautiful. Yes. And I just wanted, if you could give me the book for a moment.
Yes, of course. I think it's there.
I've got. We also have to acknowledge the magic of Shakespeare. I mean, he could do things with English which were just absolutely uncanny, and often in very, very simple, unaffected ways. His best lines, I've just quoted the making of the green one red. His best lines are the ones which are just in Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. The real heartbreaker is when Henry IV rejects Falstaff and he says, "I know thee not, old man." I know thee not. It's a timeless sentence. The end of Winter's Tale, when Leontes reaches out to the statue of Hermione, and Marlowe would have had a huge speech
with lots of Latin
and Greek and quotations,
yes.
And Leontes just says, "Oh, she's warm."
Yeah,
that's it. Yeah. I can go on.
Well, we could. I wanted to actually come on to Hamlet, and obviously to be or not to be, which is obviously a similar another example.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
But maybe
that is the question.
Yeah.
But this is a bit which I was in Midsummer Night's Dream as a schoolboy in Sherborne. I was the first fairy in green tights. And this is Oberon talking to Puck. And he's talking about the time that he had seen the love god Cupid. They're exotic figures. He has seen Cupid. And this is a 7-line speech. And I'm just going to read it to you because it is pure magic. And only Shakespeare could do this. And if you read the play, you could skim past it. But if you slow down and read it carefully, you'll see what I mean. It says, "My gentle Puck, come hither. Thou rememberest, since once I sat upon a promontory and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music." And it's magic.
I mean, one of the things that and I've only come across this with friends who maybe Middle Eastern friends, certainly Persians. I think if you start quoting Saadi or Rumi to them, they start to well up in a way that I think if you've fallen in love with Shakespeare and his language, we do as well. There is a magic, if that's the right word. There's a power to him, to his poetry, which is extraordinary, which you can't really define.
It's inexplicable.
Yes.
And I try here and there, but I could pull out. There are hundreds of passages, but one of the things I've been saying on my travels for this book, I've been encouraging readers to just go home and get out the collected works, open it at any page at random, and read the page. You'll find something. Every single page has something on it.
Well, you talk about it as being
insight or something. Sorry.
No, but I mean because you talk about it as, or the comment has been made, and you reflect this in the book that it's it's the book of life. That essentially everything is there in the works of Shakespeare.
And it becomes a sort of a mirror in which we see us. I mean, someone said that we don't read Shakespeare; he reads us. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it sounds good.
Well, there's a truth.
Yeah, there's a truth in that somewhere.
Yeah. And maybe, that's it. Maybe we can just talk about Hamlet now, because I think that's very relevant to this, because it's obviously, this is, one of the, I don't want to, is this the greatest thing that Shakespeare achieves? I don't know, but it's, this sort of discovery or the dramatization of the self and this in the inner self. And this is, I think, possibly the big difference between him and Marlowe. And it absolutely happens in Hamlet. And the chapter on that, or the chapters on that alone, I think, are worth reading the book. It's extraordinary. Perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, Hamlet comes at the end of, I said there were 2 decades. It comes at the end of his first decade as a playwright. And he's been making his way. And he's obviously getting well known because the plays, play scripts of his that are printed now have his name on them, which they didn't have to start with. The role of the playwright was not important. No one paid any attention to I've occasionally said to myself, would Shakespeare come to the Bridport Literary Festival? Well, he probably would come because Tiny would have got him to come here. But it wouldn't have been something which he sort of could see the point of, actually. That wasn't what he was about. He worked hard, and
he probably wanted to just be writing.
Writing, yeah, yes. Or being on stage or running the Globe.
Yes.
But he'd done this for 10 years, and he'd done all the history plays, which are an extraordinary run of plays, the Henrys. And all through that period, obviously what was going on in English cultural life was this discovery by the creative community of the role of the individual as a creative entity in a play or a poem or a story. The idea that, before this, narrations were very flat, and they were two-dimensional, and the character was not, and the inner life of the character was not part of what you had to intuit it as a reader. But in the 1590s, led by Marlowe, actually, more than Shakespeare, Marlowe was the first to Marlowe's plays are full of these extraordinary they're like arias. What in opera is known as Park and Bark. The actor comes to the front of the stage, delivers a fantastic speech, about 50 lines, and then goes back and the play carries on. But there's not much dramatic life. But Marlowe has recognized that as an audience, or as a reader, we want to know what's going on inside his or her psyches, in their selves, as you said, the self. Mm-hmm. So the self, this is really the first time it appears in literature. It's very, very interesting. And you see Shakespeare trying it out in his history plays. You all remember the line when the king says, let us sit up on the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. A lovely speech. And that's an attempt at trying to explain what kingship was about for a defeated king. And there are lots of other examples. There's another speech. Brutus gives a speech in Julius Caesar, in fact, about what is involved in assassinating a dictator. Again, it's Shakespeare saying, this actor who's playing this part is representing something which is very both external, which you're familiar with in his history, but also deeply internal. and private and tortuous and difficult. Very, very modern. I mean, we're full of ourselves, are we not? The self is very important.
Yes, yes.
But this was quite new. And with Hamlet, Shakespeare's tried out, the soliloquy a bit in short form. He goes full blast. And I've often wondered what it must have been like to be in whatever the theatre was, the playhouse, and to be in the first audience for Hamlet. You'd have thought, what on earth is this about? It would have seemed extraordinary. Character coming to the front of the stage, to be or not to be, shall I commit suicide, or Claudius's speeches about his unfitness to be king.
Yes.
The exposure of the inner life of these characters was enthralling to Shakespeare, and he mastered it in one play.
And yet the amazing thing is, and you say this, I think, early on in the book, that no sooner do you think that you sort of nailed Shakespeare than that something comes around that's completely the opposite. And so we've got the example of Iago. So on the one hand, we've got Hamlet.
He's very slippery.
Yeah, and yet with Iago, who does so much damage, and we never understand why. It's never explained. So we've got him as a sort of a counterweight to someone like Hamlet, who we know pretty much everything that's going on inside his mind.
And yet, as an audience, we think we know. We think we understand Iago, although actually Iago has more lines than Othello. Interestingly, okay. It's a bigger part.
Okay.
But in Act 5, this is I always love this, because if Shakespeare doesn't want to do something, he just doesn't do it. So Iago is being quizzed by, this is after Othello has died, and after Desdemona has died, and they're saying to him basically, what on earth were you up to? And he says, demand me nothing, what I know, I know.
Yes, and
and it's completely malign. And what's so brilliant about it is completely malign and completely opaque. So, but the opacity contains a sense of the character of Iago.
Yes,
and that's what's so incredible.
And sorry if this is maybe even slightly awkward sort of segue here, but I mean, it's almost as if Shakespeare, Shakespeare himself is, he's this sort of invisible man. We feel that we understand him.
Never know who he is.
We never know who he is. I mean, this line of Borges, you say he's many. Borges said he was many, and he's no more.
Yeah, you never know where he is. And there's not much that's original in this apart from what I've sort of nailed together, but it's got one phrase which I'm quite pleased about. I said that he had the thing about Shakespeare is that he has this great capacity for negligent ambiguity.
Yes, please.
It's casual. He's just. I don't want to be pinned down for being for the king or against the king or for the state or for whatever. I want to be read every possible way. I want to be ambiguous, and so the ambiguity runs all the way through the work, and it's negligent because it's so casual. Yes. It's just take it or leave it, as you like it.
And I think the ambiguity is absolutely key. I mean, you talk about, there's the Keats's phrase of negative capacity,
negative
capability.
Yeah.
And there was that wonderful quote of Pinter when he's talking about Beckett, but he could be talking about Shakespeare, where he's just saying, there are no, I'm paraphrasing, but there are, he doesn't give us any easy answers. Maybe I'll read it because it is quite a good line, because you feel that this is incredibly relevant to Shakespeare himself. So this is Pinter writing on Beckett. He says, "The farther he goes, the more good it does me. I don't want philosophies, tracts, dogmas, creeds, ways out, truths, answers, nothing from the bargain basement. He is the most courageous, remorseless writer going, and the more he grinds my nose in the shit, the more I am grateful to him. His work is beautiful." And you put that in there, I'm sure you would, well, I'm assuming you were thinking that's as relevant to Shakespeare as it is to Beckett.
And so is its opposite. That's the trick. I mean,
okay.
I could do another version of that, which was saying the exact opposite, and it would still be true. And you never know where you are. And I mean, one of the things about writing a book of this kind is you find yourself meeting a lot of ghosts, and I'm looking into this wonderful black space, and you sort of feel as though you're in this vast cathedral of language and ideas and character and creativity. And all these characters and all this greatness. And then there are all the other people who have written about him. So there's this great retinue of influenced Pinter, whoever, Beckett,
Right.
writing about him. So it's an incredible dialogue you get into. And it's just fathomless, actually. You go on and on. You just go back and back. You find more and more things.
Perhaps we could, at this point, turn to the sort of personal side of this story. Obviously, I mentioned the stroke you had in 1995, and that this is part of your sort of trilogy, your disruption trilogy. Perhaps you could just fill us in on that.
Yeah, I decided it was part of a disruption trilogy when I couldn't think how to finish it. So I thought, well, I could think of a reason for stopping. And I've written 2 books about myself and being unwell. I thought I was going to say this is the third part of the disruption. I just made it up on the spot as a way of, I couldn't think of a way, as I say, to finish it. But it does start with being very sick and being only able to, my left arm was never great, but was at that point paralyzed. I could only hold a play script. I couldn't hold a bigger book. And so when I was recovering, I was reading, and I'd read Shakespeare plays because it was part of the recovery.
And how did they help you? How did you find that?
It's that thing of great literature is very consoling. And
Yes.
so you wouldn't necessarily reread all of, I don't know, The Tempest, but you read the great speeches or something.
And they spoke to you personally?
I think it was a way of being reminded about language and literature,
Yeah.
and poetry and ideas and just what you can do with a written word.
And alongside all of this, you've got your club, your Shakespeare Club, which you talk about here. It's a group of friends you all go to see.
Well, that's the point.
Of whatever play you can.
We're not really friends, but we're a bunch of. I think there are 8 of us. They're all a bit like me. And
Right.
They're all sort of dysfunctional middle-aged men, and we meet, and we're all from the same sort of English sort of university background.
Right.
All about the same sort of age, and we go and see plays. And one of us is responsible for booking the tickets. And afterwards, we go and have a pizza meal, usually at the Pizza Express. Occasionally, we splash out, but not very often. And it's a hilarious club because we're quite passionate about the work. Some of us bring the script, and we see it, and there's a rule which has never been written down, and has never been articulated either, except by me, which is that you never talk about anything else. So you only talk about Shakespeare. So we meet, and so in the time, this club's been going for about 20 years now. I've seen 15 Hamlets in that time, probably more actually. And at the same time, this group of actually there are a couple of women. Sorry, it's not entirely misogynist outing. In that time, there've been 2 divorces. One of the group went sort of slightly off the rails completely. Another one was in rehab. 2 of them got fired. So it's all these dramas. And I always felt that if you turned up carrying an axe in a blood-stained shirt, they would have said, "Well, what about the second line of?"
So it's kind of an escape from your.
So it's very therapeutic. You don't have to worry about anything. All you do is you talk about the play, the production, the performance, how it compares to the ones we've seen before, how well it's and it's currently rather in abeyance because of this situation.
Sure. But they were sort of helpful, useful for the process of the writing of the book, I assume.
I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I've read a lot of Shakespeare and I love it. But if you want this book to tell you things that an academic could tell you, it's not the book. This is not for you. It's more personal than that.
But it's more engaging as a result, I think. I mean, you're perhaps doing yourself.
And I felt that I had to find a way. I had to lead the reader into this vast cathedral of words. And so the club is a way of saying, Shakespeare is for everyone, even people who, anyone who you don't have to be brilliant to enjoy Shakespeare. You just have to go along with an open mind, open ears, I should say probably, and just see it, and see it if you can see it live. I personally find streamed theatre It's like drinking sort of vintage wines through a straw. It's not really, it's not really the same. It's a version of what happened, but it's not the thing itself.
Yes.
If you go to a live show, there'll be things happening which no one else will ever see, and it'll be entirely for you. And when I think of Derek Jacobi's King Lear. I don't know how many in this audience saw Derek Jacobi's King Lear about 4 or 5 years ago. Absolutely outstanding. And I saw it in the Dunbar, and I was as close to Jacobi as I am to you, sitting in the front row, and he was doing the death scene, and he was crying. Well, he had, maybe he wasn't, but he had tears in his eyes. That is serious acting.
There's a visceral element there.
And when you have that experience, it's unbelievably moving, actually.
Yeah. I've got so many more questions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to, it's time to sort of pass questions out to the audience. Otherwise, we're going to run over time. So before we do, I think we have a system whereby Adrian here will try and get a microphone to you as closely as he can. And if we could keep the questions as brief and to the point as possible, that would be very welcome. So do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
Robert, I'm still confused, really, as to why Shakespeare went out of the collective consciousness of the theatre-going public and the reading public in the age of Milton and Marvel and the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and all the things that happened in the very vital 17th century.
But the theatre was closed.
Well, not during the Restoration.
Well, when the theatre came back, it was Restoration comedy and Restoration theatre. I mean, and actually, what happened is very interesting. That they rewrote Shakespeare to give him happy endings.
So the mood had changed.
So the theatre went completely underground from the 1630s. In 1642, they pulled down. I think 1642 they pulled down the Globe. The Globe was raised to the ground. The Puritans did not like the theatre. And so the theatrical profession just stopped, and it's actually not dissimilar to the situation that's in now in a way that people were doing sort of boutique things in odd places. So
printed copies of the plays were circulating, were they?
Charles I had a first folio. If you go to the Royal Collection, you can see the Charles I's notes to his edition. No, you're right. It had a life, but it was off the radar, and it wasn't until Garrick, really, the great actor David Garrick, who loved him. He was a great actor and also knew he was a great actor and loved to play the part and hog the stage. And he reminds me, I can think of 2 or 3 well-known actors present who are not dissimilar to Garrick. But anyway, Garrick made it popular, and then it caught on, and then it became fashionable, and it began to spread. But really until the 1720s, 30s, there wasn't much theatrical. There weren't many performances of, say, Romeo and Juliet.
And even in the US, I think the first, it's 1730s,
But the Americans took it up. And it's interesting, I didn't really answer that question properly, but answer that point fully. I mean, I think it was also that it answered, there would have been a nostalgia amongst the English settlers for English language, English stories, English settings. And a play like Merry Wives of Windsor would have made them feel very much at home. And so I think it was a kind of souvenir of a lost life in a way. But it was the Americans who really pushed it and developed the traveling theatrical troupe was a very American thing, in fact. And if you read Huckleberry Finn, there's a wonderful scene where 2 charlatans do a performance of a hilarious parody of Hamlet. It's a famous passage in Huckleberry Finn. I can't begin to read.
I think
It's in the book.
they sort of mix all lines from various places.
It's very entertaining.
it's very funny.
But that speaks to a strand of American life, which was the travelling troupe, putting Shakespeare on in burlesque form in pubs and saloons and so forth.
Any more questions? Tanya, here at the front.
What gives oxygen to the speculation that some of the plays are not written by Shakespeare?
Well, I think the fact that it's taken seriously gives it oxygen, which I think is bizarre. I'm not going to go into the. I'm sure there are people. Some of you are familiar with the Shakespeare denying line. There's a very simple answer. I've got a fairly short answer to this. I should preface it by saying before I came to write that book, I worked for the Observer for many years, and I on one occasion spent a very happy fortnight going around talking to directors, contemporary directors, from the late Sir Peter Hall, Tereva Nunn, Adrian Noble, Dominic Trump, anyway, a bunch of directors. And I asked them all lots of questions about Shakespeare, performing Shakespeare, directing Shakespeare. And then at the end, I'd always say to them, do you have a sense of Shakespeare the man? And they all, to a person, said they were very clear there was an intelligence behind this work which was singular and particular, and it was Shakespeare. And you can doubt that if you want. I put the question on the other. I'd say, what's the problem with it? Why couldn't somebody have done this? Can't we have? Aren't there such things? There's Mozart? There's Euripides. It's an extraordinary achievement, but I think it speaks more to us that we should entertain the idea that it couldn't have been one person. But the absolute refutation of it is this: is the first. Can I have, yes. So here's the first folio, and it says the first folio. It says the tragedies of Mr. William Shakespeare. It's beautiful. It's all laid out. There is a thing called the Droeshout. I'm not going to pronounce it. It's a Dutch Droeshout portrait. It's the one which you've seen hundreds of times. It makes him look rather self-satisfied, rather middle-aged, rather chubby, balding. And then you turn over beyond the title page, and there's a long introduction by the two actors who he'd worked with, describing what they'd done. And they were called Hemmings and Condell. They were in the King's Men from the 1590s through to Shakespeare's death. And we owe them a great debt of gratitude because they actually say Macbeth wouldn't have tamped The Tempest, As You Like It. These are plays, they only appear in the first folio. So these actors who'd worked with this William Shakespeare put together the first folio, and they write a piece saying, recalling his memory, and not to do the thing on the cheap, they go to Shakespeare's great rival, Ben Jonson. Now, Ben Jonson is a tricky character. He's incredibly vain, very garrulous, very rivalrous, touchy, hard to please. He was nobody's fool. He was notorious for being very difficult to work with. And had himself already published his own plays in a special edition in his own lifetime. Shakespeare didn't bother with that. He dies and lets the actors do it. And they get Jonson to write a poem saluting this achievement of putting all the plays into a single volume. And Jonson, who it must have cost him, he writes this paean of praise. He calls him my gentle. He refers to him as a person. And this is a poem next door to this portrait. Now, are you seriously telling me that these actors, Ben Jonson, the printers, were involved in a conspiracy? I mean, it's preposterous.
And also, why?
What is the? Why would they? And they can't have been written by Marlowe because Marlowe was dead. It can't be written by the Earl of Oxford because he was dead too. You've got a lot of explaining. There's only one word for it. It's absolutely bonkers.
I think my favourite conspiracy theory was Gaddafi used to say that it was actually written by an Arab called Sheikh Zubair, which got turned into Shakespeare. So there you go. He pays you money, he takes you seriously.
Having said that, Freud, some famous people thought there were doubts, but when you get into the detail, it just doesn't stack up.
And also your book as well. I'd like to say it just if anybody does have any doubts, you read this book, you won't have any. Just the way you link the plays with the events of the time and what we know about Shakespeare, it just works as a whole. It comes across very much as the work of one man. I mean, there's just no doubt as far as I'm concerned.
There's another. Just give me a chance to read one of my favourite bits of Shakespeare. I found my glasses. Where did I put this? I can't remember where I put it. That's towards the end. This is to do with his use of English. When he was writing, there would have been West Country English. Walter Raleigh is a West Countryman, and he is known to have used dialect words in his poetry. Shakespeare was from the Midlands, near Coventry, near Birmingham, Stratford. He would have had local dialect words. East Anglians had dialect words. Lancashire, you can find those too, but not in Shakespeare. And they pop up, these dialect words, on these local usages, quite casually. And they're the words that a country boy would use, somebody who's familiar with country life. And there's a very famous poem at the end of Cymbeline, which I love, which is "Fear no more, the heat of the sun." Fear no more, the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Now thy worldly task hast done, home art gone, and ta'en thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. Chimney sweeper is a dandelion, a full-blown dandelion. And you can see that, can't you? You can see, and you have the dust there, and that was a local Stratford word for a dandelion. I mean, that's a very specific example of somebody using quite casually. It's a brilliant image. It works for Shakespeare. You could misunderstand it. You think, what's this to do with chimney sweeps? It's not about chimney sweeps. It's about dandelions and coming to dust. So, and I could do that till the cows. I mean, there are so many examples of that sort. But it raises interesting issues. But I think the biggest issue is, why on earth would you want to entertain the idea that it couldn't be done by one person?
We've got time for maybe one more question.
Well, there is a question, but there's a comment first, because I was in Ashland in Oregon, which has a Shakespeare festival every year, in May 2017. They were also playing Julius Caesar for laughs, with the crippling handshake, the gold chain necklace, and so on. And at the end of the play, there were 4 JP's judges from California sitting in the row in front of us, who all turned around and said, "You're English, we have to apologize for our country, for our president, for everything, but we're so glad you're still here." Anyway, the question is, I've got a great niece who is studying Shakespeare at school, but only for O-level. Is this something which might speak to her, or is that just too young to get this?
Is the book? I'd hope. What I would say is, I'd encourage her to. I mean, I think how to get started on it's a good question. How do you start? I think I always try with adolescents, Romeo and Juliet, and trying to get them to read Romeo as though it's a contemporary love story, and it's so sexy and violent. It's incredible. It's also short. But then, I've got a chapter on Romeo and Juliet called "Sin of Self-Love." Which there might be a way into it. I don't know. I think the issue of how you get past the schoolroom and how you get past him being the national poet and being Shakespeare. He carries a lot of baggage now. He's become this global icon. He didn't set out to be a global icon, but it's a problem. And I think I think the key to it is to treat him as, in a way, as the man from Stratford. As an ordinary. Or an extraordinary person who just happens to be living in our midst, and still is, bizarrely.
And perhaps just get involved in plays. I mean, I know from my own experience that's what broke it for me, was just this total immersion of being in Shakespeare plays, even if you're just whatever walk on part. But all those rehearsals, you're just hearing the language again and again and again, and that for me is how it seeped in. But it's interesting, because we were talking about this just before coming on, because my children are 9 and 12, and we talk about how do you get children interested in Shakespeare, because I think it is so important. And it's just maybe see as many plays as possible.
I mean, a good production, a good modern production is it's extraordinary. Actually.
Yeah.
It's done well. I mean, I was going back to Jacobi Lear. I mean, on a stage half this size, and it's still extraordinary experience, roller coaster.
Right. Well, I think we're out of time now. Just to thank Robert for coming all this way and for being a part of this, what is an extraordinary festival, just because of its brevity, I suppose, and for such an, opening our eyes to Shakespeare and the continuing relevancy of Shakespeare. It is extraordinary how he just seems to be. We can never tire of him, and there's always fresh things to say, I think. And it is just a wonderful, wonderful book. I have enjoyed every minute of reading it, preparing it for this evening, and being with Robert. So just a round of applause for Robert. Thank you very much.